The sun was a judgment on the land, a flat white coin pasted onto a bleached sky, and the heat that fell from it was not a warmth, but a weight, pressing down on the single dusty street of Harmony Gulch as if to flatten it into memory. Nothing moved that did not have to, because movement stirred the fine red dust that coated everything, a powder so fine it seemed less like dirt and more like the sifted remains of the earth itself. And it settled on the unpainted planks of the storefronts and the drooping hats of the few men who sat motionless on porch steps, their faces already looking like effigies carved from the dry soil. It was a town holding its breath, waiting for the mercy of evening or the finality of being forgotten completely, whichever came first, and into this stillness, into this tableau of heat and dust and quiet desperation, a small figure appeared at the far end of the street, more a shimmer than a person at first, a disturbance in the heavy air. The figure resolved itself slowly, coalescing out of the heat haze into the shape of a boy, perhaps 10 years old, perhaps younger, his age impossible to tell beneath the layers of grime and the stark angles of his bones showing through his thin shirt. He moved with the wariness of a coyote, his head on a swivel, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth, and his eyes, wide and dark in his pinched face, were not the eyes of a child, but of a creature that has learned the world is a series of closed doors and empty hands. He was a ghost haunting the daylight, a walking question that the town had already decided not to answer, and as he drifted past the saloon, past the land office, past the silent watching men, he left no more impression than a dry leaf skittering in a wind that would not blow. He was looking for something, not with hope, but with the grim, methodical patience of a scavenger, his gaze sweeping the ground, the alleys between buildings, the refuse heaps behind the livery, searching for anything the world had discarded that might sustain him for another hour, another day. He was hunger given form. Way kept his back to the street, the heat of his small stove a familiar and contained thing against the vast, indifferent heat of the day outside, and the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his cleaver on the worn wooden block was the only clock he needed. The space was no bigger than a horse stall, a lean-to of scavenged lumber pressed against the side of the assayer's office, with a counter, 2 stools, and a single charcoal brazier that he tended with the devotion of a priest tending a sacred flame. This was his kingdom, a 3-by-3-meter patch of the world that he could control, where order could be imposed, and where the chaos of the town outside, with its sudden bursts of violence and its long stretches of sullen silence, could be held at bay by the simple act of dicing a carrot into perfect, uniform matchsticks. He had been in this town for 5 years, and he knew maybe 10 words of the local tongue, and they were the words for numbers and the words for food, because that was the only language that had ever been required of him. Men would come to his counter, grunt a number, and he would assemble a bowl of rice and whatever scraps of meat or vegetables he had managed to procure, and they would hand him a coin and leave without a word, the entire transaction conducted in a kind of mutual, understood silence. He was a function, not a person. He was the man who made the food. That was all. He did not mind the invisibility. He cultivated it. Invisibility was a form of armor. He had learned that lesson long ago, a continent away, in a place of green hills and winding rivers that he could barely summon to his mind's eye anymore, a place he had left to find a fortune and had instead found this, a dusty purgatory where he cooked for ghosts. He worked methodically, his hands moving with an economy that was almost beautiful, his whole world shrunk down to the feel of the knife, the smell of the ginger, the hiss of oil in the hot pan. He did not look up when the shadow fell across his doorway. He had learned not to. The boy, Eli, had been watching the cook for 3 days. He had found a spot in the narrow alley across the street, a sliver of shade between the general store and the gunsmith's, where he could sit with his back pressed against the warm wood and be almost invisible. From there, he watched the strange, quiet man in his little wooden box. He watched the way the man's hands were never still but never hurried. He watched the steam rise from the iron pot and he could smell it, a clean, savory scent that was so different from the rancid smell of the saloon's garbage or the thick, cloying odor of the tannery down the creek. The smell made his stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. A feeling so constant he barely noticed it anymore, but this was different, sharper. It was the smell of something he remembered, or thought he remembered from a time before this. A time when a meal was not something you fought for or stole, but something that simply appeared. He watched the miners and the drifters and the ranch hands come and go, taking their steaming bowls, eating quickly, their faces grim. None of them spoke to the cook. They barely looked at him, and the cook never looked at them, his eyes always on his work, his face a calm, unreadable mask. The boy understood this. It was a language he knew. The world was a dangerous place, and the best way to move through it was to make yourself small, to make yourself quiet, to pretend you were not there at all. The cook was a master of this. He was a shadow in his own kitchen. On the third day, the hunger was a living thing inside the boy, a rat gnawing at his insides. He had found nothing but a bruised, half-rotten apple in the livery's trash, and the sourness of it had only made the emptiness worse. He watched the sun begin its slow descent, painting the dust in the air a bruised orange, and he knew the cook would be closing soon. One last man, a big blacksmith with hands like sledges, collected his bowl and left. The street was empty now. The cook began his cleaning ritual, wiping down the counter, scrubbing his single pot with a handful of sand and water. The boy's legs moved before his mind had given them permission, carrying him out of the alley, across the street, until he was standing a few feet from the opening of the little kitchen, a small, silent specter in the fading light. He did not speak. He did not hold out a hand. He just stood there watching, his presence a silent, desperate prayer. Wei felt the boy's eyes on him long before he saw him. It was a different kind of attention from the impatient, transactional stares of his customers. This was a steady, quiet pressure, the gaze of a predator or a supplicant. He continued his work, moving with the same deliberate pace, pouring the dirty water out onto the dust of the street, wiping the pot dry with a worn cloth. He did not acknowledge the presence. To acknowledge it was to invite it in, and he had built his life here on the principle of not inviting anything in. The world was full of needs, an ocean of them, and if you let a single drop through the dam of your own carefully constructed solitude, you would be drowned. He knew this. He had seen it happen. But the silence stretched, and the boy did not leave. He did not move closer, but he did not retreat. Wei could feel the terrible stillness of him, the absolute focus of his hunger. He finished his cleaning, stacking his few bowls, placing the lid on his pot. The brazier was a bed of glowing orange coals, sighing softly as they died. His work was done. He could turn, pull the rough burlap curtain across the doorway, and the day would be over. The boy would still be there, on the other side of the curtain, and then he would be gone, swallowed by the night. It was not Wei's concern. It was not his world. He had his own ghosts to feed. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the memory of ginger and the faint metallic tang of the dust. He turned. The boy stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the last fiery slash of the sunset. He was so thin, a stray dog had more flesh on its bones. His eyes were huge in the twilight, fixed on Wei's face. They held no accusation, no demand, only a vast, empty space waiting to be filled. Wei's heart, a thing he had thought long dead and buried, gave a slow, painful lurch. He looked at the boy, and he saw not a stranger, but a reflection, a memory of another hungry boy in another lifetime, huddled in the ruins of a different war. He hesitated for a long moment, a lifetime, an eternity between one breath and the next. Then he turned back to his pot, his movements stiff. He lifted the lid. There was a small amount of rice left, stuck to the bottom, maybe a cupful. He scraped it carefully into a bowl, added a spoonful of the thin vegetable broth he kept for himself, and a few slivers of dried pork he had been saving. He did not look at the boy as he placed the bowl on the edge of the counter, the ceramic making a soft click against the wood. He did not speak. The gesture was enough. It was too much. The boy stared at the bowl. He did not move. He seemed not to be breathing. Wei stood with his back to him, his hands gripping the edge of his work block, his knuckles white. He heard a soft scraping sound. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The boy had taken the bowl and retreated to the edge of the street, where he squatted in the dust, cradling the bowl as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He ate with his fingers, quickly, desperately, but with a strange, solemn dignity, his eyes never leaving the bowl, as if he were afraid it might vanish if he looked away. Wei watched until the bowl was empty, until the boy had licked it clean, and then licked his own fingers. The boy looked up then, across the 20 feet of dusty ground that separated them, and his eyes met Wei's. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he placed the empty bowl on the ground, turned, and vanished into the deepening darkness. Wei stood there for a long time, the cool night air raising goosebumps on his arms. He had done a foolish thing. He had opened the door. That night, the father returned. He did not come like a storm, but like a change in the weather, a sudden drop in temperature that you feel on your skin before you understand its source. Wei was asleep on his cot in the small room behind his kitchen when the sound woke him, a soft creak of the floorboards just outside his curtained doorway. It was not the sound of a customer. It was the sound of someone who did not want to be heard. Wei was instantly awake, his body rigid, his hand reaching instinctively for the heavy cleaver he kept beside his bed. He lay in the darkness, listening, his breath held tight in his chest. The silence outside was absolute now, but it was a different kind of silence. It was a listening silence. He heard a floorboard groan again, closer this time, and then the soft scrape of the burlap curtain being pulled aside. A man's shape filled the opening to his small kitchen, a tall, lean silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering in from the street. The man stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, his head tilted as if listening for something. Wei could see the glint of a gun barrel tucked into his belt, the worn shape of a duster hanging from his shoulders. He was not a townsman. He was something else, something that drifted on the edges of the world, a creature of the night. The man took a step into the kitchen, his boots making a soft, sandy sound on the wooden floor. He moved with a lazy, confident grace, the kind of grace that comes from being comfortable with violence. "Smells good in here," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was not a compliment. It was an observation, a claim. "Smells like someone's been generous." Wei did not move, did not breathe. He remained a knot of stillness in the darkness of his back room. The man ambled over to the counter, picked up one of the clean bowls, and turned it over in his hands. He seemed to be examining the cheap porcelain as if it were fine china. "Heard you were giving out charity," the man continued, his voice conversational, but with an edge like a rusted knife. "Feeding strays. That's a kind thing to do. A foolish thing, but kind." He put the bowl down. "The thing about strays," he said, turning his head slowly, his gaze piercing the darkness towards Wei's curtained alcove, "is they always belong to someone." Wei knew then. He knew with a cold certainty that settled like a stone in his gut. This was the boy's father. This was the reason for the feral wariness in the boy's eyes, the reason he moved like a ghost through a world of threats. The man took another step, his shadow falling across Wei's sleeping space. "My boy," he said, his voice dropping lower, colder. He came back with a full belly and a clean bowl, said a Chinaman gave it to him. He paused. "Now, I appreciate you looking out for him. I do. But you and me, we need to have a little talk about property." Wei pushed himself up from the cot, his bare feet silent on the packed earth floor of his sleeping room. He did not pick up the cleaver. Bringing a knife to a gunfight was a fool's game, and he was not a fool. He was a cook. He was a survivor. He pushed aside the thin blanket that served as his door and stepped into the kitchen, into the moonlight that sliced the room in two. The man, Silas, watched him emerge, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. He was taller than Wei, gaunt but wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved from sun-dried leather and then left out in the rain. His eyes were pale, almost colorless in the dim light, and they held a chilling emptiness. "There you are," Silas said as if greeting an old friend. "Thought you might be shy." Wei stood before him, clad only in his thin trousers, his hands held loosely at his sides. He did not speak. He waited. His stillness was his only weapon, his silence his only shield. Silas gestured with his head towards the street. "My boy, Eli, he's a good boy when he's not being a burden, but he's got a habit of running off, and a habit of attracting the wrong kind of attention." He took a step closer, invading Wei's space, his breath a sour mix of cheap whiskey and neglect. "See, when people are kind to him, he gets ideas. He starts to think he doesn't need me, and that's a problem, because he does need me. And he paused, letting the word hang in the air, need him." The meaning was clear. The boy was a tool, a shield, a piece of property. Wei's gaze did not waver from the man's face. He could see the years of casual cruelty etched around his eyes, the selfishness that had hollowed him out from the inside. He thought of the boy, squatting in the dust, cradling the bowl of rice. He thought of the small, solemn nod. The boy was hungry, Wei said, his voice quiet, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. It was more than he had said to any customer in a year. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. They're always hungry, it's their nature. You feed one, you'll have a dozen more at your door by sunrise. You should know that. Your kind, you're supposed to be smart. The casual racism was a familiar sting, one he had learned to ignore, but tonight it felt different, sharper. It was part of the same sickness that allowed this man to look at his own son and see only a burden. He's not here, Wei said, his voice flat. He ate. He left. Silas's smile faded. I know he left. I was watching. I saw you two have your little moment. His eyes narrowed. But he'll be back. You gave him a taste of something. He'll be back for more. And when he comes back, you're going to tell him his pa is looking for him. You're going to tell him to come find me down by the creek. You understand? It was an order, delivered with the casual authority of a man used to being obeyed. Wei gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. A single motion. No. Silas's face darkened. The lazy confidence fell away, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. No? He repeated, his voice dangerously soft. You're telling me no? He took another step, his hand dropping to the butt of the pistol at his hip. Maybe you don't understand the situation. I'm a wanted man. Things are difficult. A boy is a useful thing to have. People feel sorry for a man with a boy. He was laying his cards on the table, revealing the pathetic, monstrous logic of his life. He is just a boy, Wei said, the words barely a whisper. He is my boy, Silas hissed, his face inches from Wei's. And you are a guest in this country, a guest who would be wise not to interfere in family business. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the summer heat. The door to a quiet life, a life of invisibility, had been opened, and now this had walked in. The standoff held for a long, breathless moment, two figures frozen in a tableau of moonlight and shadow, the fate of a child hanging between them. Wei could feel the tremor in his own hands, the frantic beat of his heart against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of placid calm. He had faced down men with guns before, in a different world, and he knew the secret was to show no fear, to become a rock, a thing that could not be easily moved. Silas seemed to be wrestling with a decision, his thumb stroking the hammer of his pistol. The cost of killing a man, even a solitary Chinese cook, was a complication he likely didn't need. It would draw attention, questions. But the insult of being refused, the challenge to his authority, was a powerful goad. The tension was broken by a new sound from the street, the heavy, rhythmic tread of booted feet. One man, walking with purpose. A lantern swung in the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows. Silas stiffened, his head snapping toward the doorway. He instinctively took a step back, melting into the deeper shadows of the kitchen, his hand now fully on his gun. Wei did not move. A figure appeared in the opening, broad-shouldered and solid, the light from his lantern preceding him. It was the town marshal, Garrett, a man whose face was as grim and weathered as the land he presided over. Garrett's eyes swept the small kitchen, his gaze lingering for a moment on Silas's retreating form, then settling on Wei. Everything all right in here, Wei? Garrett's voice was low and steady. He was a man who rarely raised his voice because he rarely had to. Wei knew Garrett the same way he knew all the others, as a customer who took his food and left his coin. But there was a watchfulness in the marshal that the other men lacked. Garrett saw things. He had seen the boy, Eli, haunting the edges of the town. Wei was sure of it. And he had seen Silas drift into town at dusk, a piece of human wreckage washed up by the prairie tides. He was not here by accident. Before Wei could answer, Silas stepped forward from the shadows, forcing a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Everything's fine, Marshal, just having a friendly chat with the proprietor here. Garrett's gaze shifted to Silas, taking in the worn duster, the hand hovering near the gun, the desperation poorly masked by bravado. You're a long way from friendly, mister, Garrett said, his tone flat. And a long way from home, I'd wager. He lifted the lantern, the light falling fully on Silas's face. There was a flicker of recognition in the marshal's eyes. I know you, he said, not as a question. Saw a poster on you, maybe 6 months back. Robbery over in the territory. A man ended up dead. Silas's forced smile vanished completely. The air in the tiny kitchen became thick, heavy, charged with the sudden, undeniable prospect of death. That poster was mistaken, Silas said, his voice tight. A misunderstanding. They always are, Garrett replied, his own hand now resting on the butt of his holstered Colt. The marshal's eyes moved from Silas to Way, and then to the empty bowl still sitting on the counter. He understood. He saw the entire story in that one small, clean bowl. This about the boy? Garrett asked, his question directed at the room itself. Silas's jaw tightened. That's my son. This is a family matter. It stopped being a family matter when you made him a party to your running, Garrett said. And it became my matter when you brought your trouble into my town. And it became his, he nodded at Way. When he showed your boy a kindness you forgot how to give. The simple, unadorned truth of the statement seemed to stun Silas into silence. He looked from the implacable marshal to the quiet cook, and he saw himself caught between two different kinds of strength, one loud and official, the other silent and unyielding. The rat was cornered, the moment stretched, thin and brittle as old glass. Silas stood trapped in the lantern light, his face a mask of fury and desperation. He was a man with nothing left to lose but the last, pathetic instrument of his survival, his son. And now that was being taken from him, not by force, but by a simple bowl of rice. The injustice of it, in his warped perception, was more than he could bear. His hand tightened on his pistol, his knuckles white. He was calculating his chances. One shot for the marshal, maybe one for the cook. He might make it to the street, to the darkness. He might not. It was a gamble he had clearly made before. Way saw the decision flicker in Silas's pale eyes. He saw the slight shift in weight, the tightening of the muscles in his shoulder. Death had entered the room. It was waiting for a signal, and then Way did something no one expected. He took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly between Silas and the marshal. He raised a hand, not in a gesture of surrender, but of pause. "Wait," he said. The word was soft, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Both men looked at him, surprised. He turned his gaze to Silas, and for the first time, he spoke to him not as a threat to be endured, but as a man. "You are wanted," Way said, stating the simple fact. "You cannot stay here. You cannot keep the boy. He will be taken from you, or he will starve with you." Silas's face twisted in a sneer. "What's it to you?" Way ignored the question. He turned and walked back into his small, dark, sleeping alcove. For a moment, Garrett and Silas just watched, confused. Way knelt on the floor, his hands feeling beneath his thin mattress. He pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle, no bigger than his fist. It was heavy. He walked back into the kitchen, into the light, and stood before Silas. He held out the bundle. "I was saving this," he said, his voice low and even, "to go home, to see the ocean again." He pushed the bundle into Silas's unresisting hand. "It is not much, but it is enough to buy a horse, enough to get you far away from here, far away from the posters." Silas stared down at the bundle in his hand, dumbfounded. He could feel the weight of the coins through the cloth. It was more money than he had seen in a year. It was a ticket. It was freedom. He looked up at Way, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Why?" he asked, the word a hoarse whisper. "What's the catch?" Way looked past him, his gaze directed at the empty doorway, at the night that had swallowed the boy. "The catch," Way said, his voice barely audible, "is that you leave him. You ride north, you ride south, I do not care. But you do not look back. He is not your son anymore. He does not belong to you. He belongs to the world now. Let it have him." The offer was audacious. It was insane. It was a trade, a man's entire savings, his only dream of home, for the life of a boy who was not his. It was a transaction Silas understood. He was a man who dealt in the buying and selling of human connection, and here was the ultimate deal. He looked at the money in his hand, then at the marshal, then back at Way. The wildness in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating light. He could fight and likely die or be captured, or he could take the money and disappear. For him, it was not a choice at all. Silas clutched the bundle of coins, his fingers working at the knot, his eyes hungry for the glint of silver. He looked at Way, a strange mix of contempt and grudging respect on his face. He could not comprehend the nature of the sacrifice, but he understood the value of the coin. "He's a scrawny thing," Silas said, his voice attempting a final pathetic assertion of ownership. "More trouble than he's worth." It was his way of saving face, of pretending the choice was his, that he was discarding something of little value. Wei did not reply. He simply stood, waiting. His face was calm, but inside, his world was tilting on its axis. The small, heavy bundle that had been the anchor of his life for 5 years, the physical manifestation of a fading hope, was gone. He felt strangely light, unmoored. Marshall Garrett watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He had not lowered his lantern, nor moved his hand from his gun. He was a witness, a silent arbiter. He could have arrested Silas. The poster was reason enough. It was his duty. But he had also seen Wei's offer, an act of such quiet, profound grace that it seemed to exist outside the town's rough calculus of crime and punishment. It was a different kind of justice, a solution that did not involve a rope or a cell. Silas looked one last time at the marshal. "You just going to let me walk?" he asked, a hint of his old swagger returning. Garrett was silent for a moment. "The poster was for a man who robbed a payroll," he said slowly. "It didn't say anything about a man who sold his son for a handful of silver." The marshal's words were a judgment colder and sharper than any court could deliver. He lowered his lantern slightly. "I see a man with a fast horse and a long ride ahead of him. I suggest you get to it. If I see your face in this territory again, I'll remember the poster." It was a dismissal, an act of mercy or perhaps practicality. Silas gave a short, ugly laugh. He looked at Wei. "You're a fool, Chinaman," he said, stuffing the bundle of coins into his duster pocket. He did not say thank you. He did not look for the boy. He simply turned and strode out of the kitchen, his boots crunching in the dust, the sound fading quickly into the vast, indifferent silence of the night. He was gone. The kitchen was suddenly quiet, the air still thick with the echoes of the confrontation. Wei stood in the middle of the room, his hands empty. He felt a wave of dizziness, the cost of his choice washing over him. He had cut the last tie to his past, to the man he used to be. Marshall Garrett lowered his lantern completely, plunging the room into softer shadows. He looked at Wei, his gaze lingering on the man's exhausted face. "That was your passage home," Garrett stated, his voice quiet. Wei gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "Home is far away," he said. He walked over to the counter and picked up the empty bowl the boy had left. He held it in both hands, his thumbs tracing its smooth, clean rim. Garrett watched him for another moment, then nodded slowly. "You get any more trouble, you come find me," he said. It was not an order, it was an offer, an acknowledgement. He turned and left, his own footsteps receding, leaving Wei alone in his small, empty kingdom, holding a bowl that was no longer empty, but full of the weight of a life. Days later, the sun was the same, the dust was the same, the sullen silence of the town was the same. But in the small lean-to kitchen, something had changed. Wei moved through his morning ritual, the familiar rhythm of the cleaver on the block, the hiss of the pan, the steam from the rice pot. But he was not alone. In the corner, by the entrance, the boy Eli sat on an overturned crate. He was holding a small knife and a pile of carrots, attempting to mimic Wei's precise cuts. His efforts were clumsy, the pieces of carrot uneven, some too thick, some too thin, more a collection of orange chunks than uniform matchsticks. He was frowning in concentration, his tongue stuck out of the corner of his mouth. He did not speak. He had not spoken a word since the night his father had disappeared. Wei had found him the next morning, huddled in the alleyway where he used to watch from, asleep and shivering despite the morning warmth. Wei had touched his shoulder, and the boy had flinched, his eyes wide with a familiar terror. Wei had simply pointed to his kitchen, then turned and walked away, leaving the choice to him. An hour later, the boy had appeared in the doorway, a silent, tentative shadow. He had not left since. Wei had not asked him to stay, and he had not asked him to leave. He had simply made room for him. He gave him a corner to sleep in, a bowl of rice for every meal, and small tasks to occupy his hands, sweeping the floor, washing the bowls, and now, cutting the vegetables. They worked in a shared silence that was not empty, but companionable. It was a language of shared space, of mutual, unspoken understanding. The townsmen who came for their food noticed the boy, of course. They would glance at him, then at Wei, their faces showing a flicker of curiosity or suspicion or something that might have been a grudging respect. No one said anything. Marshall Garrett would stop by every day, not for food, but to stand for a moment at the counter, his gaze taking in the scene. He would nod at Wei, a silent affirmation, and then move on. The town had absorbed the change, the way the earth absorbs a slow rain. The boy, Eli, was no longer a ghost. He was becoming a person. The hollows in his cheeks were beginning to fill out. The fear in his eyes had not vanished, but it had retreated, like a tide going out, leaving behind a shoreline of watchfulness and a burgeoning curiosity. He would watch Wei's hands for hours, his gaze intense, absorbing the craft, the economy of motion. One afternoon, as Wei was showing him how to properly bank the coals of the brazier to keep them alive overnight, the boy spoke for the first time. He pointed a small, grimy finger at the Chinese characters Wei had long ago painted on a scrap of wood above the stove. "What's that say?" he asked, his voice raspy from disuse. Wei looked at the characters. He hadn't truly seen them in years. They were a ghost of his own, a relic from a life he had almost forgotten. He touched the faded black strokes with his fingertips. "It says," Wei replied, his voice soft, "the best salt is the sweat of your own brow." The boy considered this for a long moment, his brow furrowed. He looked at his own small, clumsy hands, then back at the characters. He nodded slowly, as if he understood, as if he had always known. We often think of strength as a shout, a defiance that announces itself to the world with fire and thunder. We imagine it in the grand gesture, the heroic stand, the battle won against impossible odds. But perhaps true strength, the kind that remakes the world, is a quieter thing. Perhaps it is as quiet as the scrape of a bowl on a wooden counter, as quiet as a door left open, as quiet as a man giving away his only dream of home to buy a stranger's future. The story of Wei and Eli is not a story of heroes. It is a story of survivors, of the small, almost invisible acts of grace that allow us to endure. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do for another is to simply see them, to acknowledge their hunger, and to offer them a share of what little they have. It is in these quiet transactions of dignity that we find our truest selves, not in the noise we make, but in the silence we are willing to share. Thank you for being here with us, for sharing this space and this quiet story. The world can often feel like a loud and lonely place, and it is a gift to be able to sit together in the stillness for a while. What was the quietest, kindest act that ever changed your world? Let us know in the comments below. Your stories are a part of our story. And if this story found a home with you, we hope you'll consider joining our community so we can continue to share these moments together. Until next time, be well and be kind.